Hi, this is Dr. David Tranter, and welcome to the third video in our series, Relationships Matter Most, an introduction to the third path framework for student well-being and achievement. And in this third video, we're going to talk about the third path framework itself. But let's start with where we started. And we started by reflecting on the larger question of the true goal of education. We wanted to clarify that the true goal of education wasn't merely the delivery of curriculum. The job of a teacher is not simply to deliver the curriculum and that's it. The job of education is not a whole bunch of years and a lot of curriculum and that's it. There is a larger purpose to education, and we would argue that that's the development of human beings, the whole human being. And that the curriculum is not the end goal. The curriculum is the what. It is the tool. It's what is taught. And the curriculum should be done in service of the why, which is human development. With that clarified, it brings up the importance of how, because it poses the question, how do we deliver the curriculum to maximize human development? And that's what led us to our next question. And that was really looking at what human development really is. What are all the models of human development and how do they define it? How do they explain how one goes about maximizing human development and overall human well-being? I spent a very long time looking at all these models, trying to look for commonalities among them because they use different terminology, different language. But there are a lot of commonalities among them. The other thing is that these models are not sort of for the educational domain. They include things like the importance of stable housing and things like that, which are important, of course, to human development and overall human happiness and well-being, but it's not really the role of education. So I looked at what are the components of human development and well-being, and which of those components have a role in education. And here's what we ended up being able to conclude, that you can find components, in fact, we call these conditions, that support the development of well-being in a variety of forms, and that actually these conditions, not only are there a finite number of them, but they're kind of potentially hierarchical, that some are more fundamental, more basic human needs than others. Think Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. It's not that different than that idea that some things are just more fundamental. And that when we're talking about the conditions, we're really talking about the connections between people in that environment. We're really talking about relationships. And that finally, that all of these models of human development and overall well-being didn't separate well-being and achievement, that they saw those as one thing. So this lent much more kind of credence to the idea of a third path, that there are conditions that will support well-being and achievement. But to be clear, that these conditions are really defined by the nature of connections. And so we ended up developing a third path framework. And I want to be clear again that this isn't a program, it's not a strategy, it's an integrative framework. It asks the question, what do students need in order to succeed in general? Not just academically, but well-being wise. And that, as I said, the conditions really are all about the nature of the connections of the relationships. And this is where the idea of we saw in the second video, the idea of a kind of gardener mindset, looking at the ingredients of the soil, are so important, because the conditions talk about the ingredients of making a fertile soil for students to learn and develop in. And as I think I go through these conditions, that'll be a lot more clear to you. So condition one, we'll start kind of at the most fundamental one. The most fundamental condition is that of safety. Now this includes physical safety, but as we were writing our book, we assumed that educators know that physical safety is really important. So we really focused on clarifying what emotional safety really was and why it's important to learning and development. And this just is just true for all kids, but it's particularly complicated when students come from homes that lack emotional safety at home. and how to foster emotional safety in a classroom, even when that might not be happening at home. The other thing we wanted to really clarify is that when we say safety, we're talking about safety to, not safety from. I just want to take a minute to describe that. Safety from is the kind of safety in which you kind of promise kids and their parents, say, don't worry, your child's feelings will never be hurt. We will protect them from challenging ideas, challenging feelings, from being upset, from all of those kinds of things. Not only do we believe that you can't make that promise in education, that to at least some degree, resilience is born out of challenging ideas and challenging situations. And so not only can you not promise it, in some cases it's not even necessarily something you want. What we're talking about is safety too. We're talking about safety for kids to be themselves, to bring themselves to school, all aspects of themselves, even those aspects of themselves that may be sad or grieving or have complicated behaviors or complicated feelings. Safety for the whole child to be at school. So it's a really quite a different type of safety than what we sometimes mean when we say safety, because we often are talking about safety from, but we're really talking about safety too. The next one on our hierarchy, as we kind of go around the circle here, is regulation, and particularly emotional regulation. And this is not new to education. This has been around for a long time, and we're just putting it in there as a really, really important thing. But we really highlight the importance of co-regulation. Always remembering that relationships are critical to learning and development, that we're highly social creatures, and that so much of our emotional self is really in response to our relationships and our environment, and that it's really all about co-regulation. Also, a really important thing is it's the co-regulation of difficult emotions rather than the banishing of them. And what we mean, again, is helping kids slowly recognize and learn to deal with some of their more complicated and difficult emotions, rather than always insisting kids be calm or compliant, or not show some of those more difficult emotions. We're trying to get away from ideas of control and more into ideas of genuine co-regulation. The next one is belonging. Belonging is something that's been around for a long time. Most people know the term very well. One of the things, though, that people maybe don't always fully recognize is how do you really do it? Belonging is one of those tricky terms in some ways, is that people assume they understand it. But really it's about the power of tiny moments of connection, the accumulation of all those moments of connection. And it's about learning to maximize all of those moments of connection. They accumulate to define the relationships and to create a sense of belonging. Belonging is critical to learning and development, but it is the accumulation of all these seemingly small and seemingly unimportant moments, but they are critical because they add up to define belonging. The fourth one is positivity, and this one I want to be clear about because it can be misunderstood. We're not talking really about insisting that kids have a positive mindset. We're talking about the mindset of the educators. It's important, of course, that kids feel very positively about school, and that educators feel positively about their students. But so much of this is driven by the attitude and the mindset of the educator, and our focus and positivity is more of the mindset of the educator than the student, with the understanding that when the educator has that mindset, then the student is going to feel and respond to that positive mindset. And that's really how to build a positive mindset in the student. There's no shortcut where you can just simply give the kids for a positive mindset skill set, and not necessarily hold that yourself as an educator. Now, as we do that, the fifth one is engagement, but I want to stop and just say this is what we call the foundational four, because engagement is really about engagement in learning, but we want to recognize that in order for students to be genuinely and readily engaged in learning, that it's important for them to feel emotionally safe. It's important for them to be emotionally regulated. It's important for them to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of positivity. And then they can be more naturally engaged in learning. You can stand over a child and force them to engage in learning, or you can create the conditions under which they'll naturally engage in learning. So we call these first four the foundational four because they're really the foundation to engagement in learning. So as we move on to engagement, there's lots and lots and lots you can say about engagement, but we highlight the importance of really understanding what it looks like to be intellectually engaged with learning, and the limits of mental energy and working with the kind of cognitive capacity of kids, so that we maximize the amount of engagement that they can do. Then we move on to identity, and hopefully you can kind of begin to see a bit of a hierarchy here, not just in terms of more fundamental things like emotions, but also developmental things, because as we're getting into things like identity, we're getting into things that are a little bit further down the developmental path. We're getting into older kids who are really starting to want to explore and express who they are. And this is where we really get back to the critical importance of having a gardener mindset, where we don't, as educators, judge in advance how children should be or who they should be, but we create an environment in which children can explore and express who they are. We're, of course, not saying anything about the fact that there really needs to be school rules and expectations. That's all really true. But it's really appreciating the differences among young people in terms of their potential and capacities, and also helping them learn to appreciate the differences between themselves and their peers. Then we move on to mastery. And of course, this is not a new concept, but it's about how critical it is that every child experiences moments of success. So when we talk about mastery, we're not talking about young people feeling like they've mastered something all the time. We're talking about those moments of success and the critical need to have enough of them to sustain motivation, and how important it is to recognize and celebrate moments of success. And then finally, at the kind of, in a sense, the top of the hierarchy, but you can see that this is actually a circle, which we'll talk about in a sec, is really about meaning. It's about the importance of learning to be meaningful and fulfilling. We often talk about education as involving student success, but it's important to talk about it as education involving student fulfillment, that learning is fulfilling. Another important aspect of meaning is that it's important for each student to feel meaningful at school. That is critical in nature too. So it's not just that the curriculum in education needs to feel meaningful, that each student needs to feel meaningful in the classroom. These together then create these 8 conditions, create a kind of an ecosystem, and a school climate, an environment, a culture. These are the conditions of the soil for students to thrive. And our argument is that if you invest your time and energy in thinking about how you can strengthen each of these 8 conditions, then you're creating a rich environment for kids to thrive. I do also want to say that we've intentionally made this a circle rather than some sort of stepwise hierarchy, because you can start anywhere, and you're always kind of going around the circle to develop these, to make them stronger and better. So it's not some sort of rigid hierarchy where you say get belonging done and then you move on to positivity. You work on all of these at the same time. But there's a kind of a rough hierarchy in the sense that perhaps you're working on engagement and engagement is not happening. And this model encourages educators to ask the question, well, what about positivity? Do I have that in place? What about belonging or regulation or emotional safety? Do I have that in place? Perhaps the reason that my students aren't engaging in learning is that I haven't strengthened some of those lower order conditions. If I was to summarize some of the key points of the framework, it would be the following 10 things. Again, it's a framework, not a program. So that allows you to deliver whatever programs, whatever instructional strategies, whatever initiatives you have. It's not meant to compete with those. It's meant to be the foundation of those, to ensure that those are done with understanding and fidelity. And in so many ways, it's a kind of philosophy, and we often talk about it as a conversation, something that educators need to be talking about all the time, about what does emotional safety mean, what does emotional regulation mean, and on and on. It fosters a conversation, an ongoing conversation about what students need in order to succeed. We also are not telling educators specifically how to build emotional safety or any of the other conditions. We give lots of examples in our book, but we really want people to suit those conditions to their students and their student needs. So we talk about belonging, or any of the other conditions. We're encouraging educators to know their students and know their students' needs and think about how they can build belonging, for example, with them. As I said, it really focuses on the how and the why, not just the curriculum, not just the what. It's hierarchical, as I said, but not a rigid hierarchy. You can start anywhere in the 8 conditions, but as you kind of dig into some of these conditions and maybe struggle, as I said, you may find that you need to go to a kind of a lower order condition and strengthen that one before you can move on. All of these conditions are familiar terms, but they're not easy. In fact, some of them are kind of counterintuitive in terms of how you build them. And of course, as I've said repeatedly, these conditions are built through the connections, the nature of relationships that we have with their students, and ultimately between students, and even with parents and caregivers, and ultimately with the community. One of the things that's really important is this is a framework that doesn't talk about student skills or student attributes or what students need to do. This is really a focus on the educators themselves. How do the educators build these conditions? It's a lot less, again, of a kind of a carpenter mindset and so much more about the gardener mindset. And then finally, one of the things that we say repeatedly when we talk to educators is a reminder to them that they are the strategy. All kinds of, strategies are really important. Social emotional strategies, instructional strategies, they're all really important. But the consistent theme in all of this is that you're the strategy that matters the most. And if you don't work on yourself as the strategy, those other kinds of strategies may fall flat. Well, there you go. That's the Third Path framework. We're going to do one more video now where I'm going to give you some big ideas of implementation. So please join me for that one. And thanks. Bye-bye.